Lucas Montgomery had built an empire from the ground up. As a child, he'd grown up in the shadows of his father's large corporate holdings. But unlike his father, Lucas wasn't content to simply inherit. He was driven by a need to leave his own mark on the world, to prove that he could do something truly remarkable. And so he did. At just 39, he was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm that was constantly in the spotlight, always under scrutiny. His name appeared on the covers of magazines, his face was in news outlets, and investors lined up to hear his every word. But in his world of boardrooms, sharp suits, and high-stakes decisions, Lucas had become accustomed to predictability. He knew how people would react to him before they even opened their mouths. Whether it was admiration or fear, awe or calculation, Lucas had mastered the art of moving through a room. But when he stepped into the unassuming offices of Harbour & Bloom, a small but innovative creative agency, nothing about the situation felt predictable. Lucas had no intention of staying more than 20 minutes. He wasn't here for the pitch meeting or the numbers. They didn't interest him. No, he was here out of boredom and a desire to observe. His firm had invested in one of their digital marketing tools, and the returns had been good. But something about the agency intrigued him beyond the business aspects. It wasn't the product, it wasn't the numbers, it was the people behind it. He'd heard their work was powerful, impactful in ways that left a lasting impression on those who encountered it. As he entered the conference room, people straightened in their chairs, and he caught the familiar flicker of curiosity in their eyes. It was the same everywhere he went, a reaction he was long accustomed to. But one woman at the far end of the table didn't even look up. She was quiet, absorbed in her notes, her laptop open in front of her. She didn't seem out of place. No, it was more that she seemed completely at ease in a space where everyone else was either trying to impress or hold back. Her presence was subtle, and yet there was an undeniable strength about her. The way she held herself, the confidence in her movements, it was effortless. She wasn't loud, wasn't drawing attention to herself. And yet, when she spoke, everyone listened. Her name was Grace Moore. Lucas noticed the way she carried herself from the very first moment. While the rest of the team looked to him, eager to make their mark, Grace barely glanced up from her screen. But when she spoke, her voice had a calm, steady quality. It was the kind of voice that made you listen, not because it was commanding, but because it was reassuring. There was something about her, a quiet power that radiated from her without effort. She didn't seek validation. She didn't need it. The meeting proceeded, but Lucas found himself drawn to her. It wasn't just the way she spoke, it was the way she seemed to move through the room with an unspoken authority. When she disagreed with an idea, she did it with grace, presenting her thoughts with a measured calm. No one felt dismissed, but they all understood that her words carried weight. When the meeting ended, Lucas wasn't in any rush to leave. He lingered, chatting casually with the creative director and a few of the other team members. But as much as they all tried to engage him in conversation, his mind kept drifting back to Grace. She was part of the team, but not like the others. The other members were eager to please, to make their mark, but Grace, she simply was. There was no pretension, no hidden agendas. It was a rare quality in his world, and it intrigued him. The next day, Lucas found an excuse to return to Harbour & Bloom. He told himself it was to follow up on the latest campaign. But in reality, he just wanted another glimpse of Grace. He arrived at the office unannounced, expecting the same quiet response. But this time, he was surprised when Grace greeted him personally. There was no question about his sudden appearance, no attempt to read too deeply into his motives. She simply offered him coffee, a small act of kindness, and he accepted. They spent the next hour discussing nothing of particular importance. Work wasn't even the subject of their conversation. They talked about art, music, and their favorite places to travel. For Lucas, it was a welcome change. He was used to people wanting something from him. But Grace didn't seem to want anything. She didn't ask for his attention. She didn't try to impress him. She just existed in her own space, and for some reason, that felt more authentic than anything he had encountered in years. Over the following weeks, Lucas found himself returning to the agency more often. Each time, he found a way to insert himself into her routine, whether it was a casual comment on a book she was reading or a shared walk to the elevator. Grace never seemed to mind. She was always polite, always friendly, but she kept a slight distance. Lucas couldn't blame her. After all, men like him were known for their fleeting interest. He had come to expect that kind of guarded reaction from women, especially those who weren't enamored by his wealth or position. But Lucas didn't care. He wasn't interested in her for any of the reasons that typically drove people to him. It wasn't her looks or her status. It wasn't the usual allure of conquest. No, it was something deeper, something real, something that made him want to show up again and again, not for business, but for her. As time went on, Lucas found himself asking more personal questions. He inquired about her childhood, her dreams, her favorite authors. Each time, she answered with a hint of reservation, as though she was unsure of how much to reveal. He couldn't tell if she was simply private or if she had been hurt in the past. But he respected her boundaries. He wasn't in a hurry to rush her into revealing anything. He simply wanted to know her better. Gradually, the walls began to soften. She started smiling at his dry jokes. She asked him about his favorite places to eat. Conversations stretched into the evening, their connection growing slowly, subtly, like the beginning of a beautiful song. There were no grand gestures, no fireworks, just a quiet understanding, a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, this was something real. But Lucas didn't know yet that the most important part of their story was still waiting to unfold. A day was coming when everything he thought he understood about Grace would be turned upside down. He didn't know it yet, but when he saw her again, at the grocery store, of all places, everything would change. The woman he'd come to trust, the woman he'd fallen for, would reveal a part of herself he never could have imagined. And in that moment, Lucas would have to decide if he could handle the truth. Would the love he was beginning to feel be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds? Or would the discovery of her secret tear them apart? Lucas had always been the kind of man who could navigate the world with ease, whether it was the high-pressure boardrooms or the exclusive social circles he frequented. Everything had a predictability to it. The rules were clear, and he knew exactly how to play the game. Success had come to him early, and he had grown accustomed to the attention, the admiration, and the occasional envy. People liked to be around him, not necessarily because of who he was, but because of what he represented: wealth, power, influence. Yet Grace was different. She was the antithesis of everything he knew, and that was precisely what had drawn him to her. There was no pretense, no showmanship. She wasn't playing the game. It was as though she was outside of the system altogether, existing in a realm of her own where none of the usual rules applied. And for the first time in a long while, Lucas found himself not just intrigued but unsettled. He'd thought he understood her, that he had a handle on who she was. He believed he had her figured out, a quiet, intelligent woman who had built her career from the ground up. Her modesty, her lack of desire for attention, made her more compelling than any woman he had ever known. And though their connection had grown slowly, it had grown nonetheless. They spent time together outside of work, often in places where neither of them was recognized or bothered. They found solace in each other's company, a shared calm in the storm of their busy lives. The dinners were simple, the walks casual, but the conversations were real. He had begun to believe that this was something genuine, something lasting. But all of that changed the moment he saw her at the grocery store. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of lazy, peaceful day when the world felt just a little slower. Lucas had decided to stop by the local market to pick up a few items, a task so mundane it felt almost beneath him. He was used to private shopping experiences, to having someone else handle these details. But today, he wanted the simplicity of it, the normalcy that most people took for granted. It was during this brief excursion that he saw her. Grace, standing in the aisle with two small children. It wasn't just that she was there. It was the way they interacted. The children, a boy and a girl, were clinging to her, laughing as she playfully teased them about their choice of snacks. And then, in an instant, it hit him, the way they looked at her, the way they called her Mom. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to go quiet. Grace had children. He had never known. She'd never mentioned it, not in the countless hours they'd spent together, not in any of their late-night conversations. He had always assumed that she was just focused on her career, that perhaps her life outside of work was just as solitary as hers had seemed. But this changed everything. The shock of it left him standing there, frozen for a beat longer than he intended. Grace turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression immediately shifting from one of carefree amusement to something more guarded. Her smile faltered for a brief moment, and Lucas felt a pang of guilt for intruding into a part of her life she had so carefully kept hidden from him. "Lucas," she said softly, her tone neutral, though there was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. "I didn't expect to see you here." He nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "I didn't expect to see you with them," he managed, motioning toward the children. Grace's gaze dropped to the ground for a moment before she looked back up at him, her smile fading. "I didn't think I had to tell you." There was a vulnerability in her voice that he hadn't heard before. It was like she had stepped into a part of her life she had clearly kept closed off from him. And it was a vulnerability that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Lucas had always prided himself on being able to read people, to understand them. Yet here was Grace, a mystery he couldn't solve. She had hidden this part of herself so completely, and now that he had stumbled upon it, he didn't know how to react. "Are they yours?" Lucas asked before he could stop himself. It wasn't an accusatory question, but there was a certain edge to it. His words felt too sharp, too invasive. He immediately regretted them, but the damage had been done. Grace glanced at the children, her eyes softening as she did. "Yes," she said quietly, but then she quickly added, "They're my niece and nephew. I'm helping to take care of them." The relief that washed over Lucas was palpable, but it didn't last long. His mind immediately began to race. The fact that she was helping to raise them made sense. It explained her reluctance to talk about her personal life, the way she had always been so private about her relationships. But even then, something felt off. It wasn't the children. It was the way Grace reacted to the question, as though there was more to the story than she was letting on. He found himself unsure of what to say next, unsure of how to process this new information. Grace's life had just gotten more complicated in his eyes, and the more he thought about it, the more questions began to surface. How long had she been raising them? What had happened to their parents? Why hadn't she mentioned any of this to him? "Grace," he said after a moment, his voice softer now. "I didn't mean to make things awkward. I didn't know." She shook her head, a small bitter laugh escaping her lips. "It's not awkward, Lucas. It's just complicated." The words hung in the air between them, and Lucas couldn't help but feel the weight of them. He had always believed that Grace was a simple woman, someone who didn't have baggage, who didn't come with hidden layers. But now he realized just how wrong he had been. She was far more complex than he had ever imagined, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized he was no longer sure of who she really was. The children, oblivious to the tension between them, continued to examine the snack aisle, their laughter ringing in Lucas's ears. Grace's gaze lingered on them for a moment before she returned her attention to him. "I should go," she said quietly, her voice tinged with something Lucas couldn't quite identify. "I have to get them home." "Of course," he replied, the words feeling inadequate. "Take care of yourself, Grace." She offered him a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. As she walked away, Lucas stood there, still processing everything he had just learned. What had he just stumbled upon? Why had Grace kept this part of her life so guarded? And more importantly, what did this mean for the connection they had begun to build? As the moment stretched on, Lucas felt a sense of unease settle in the pit of his stomach. He had no answers, only more questions, and the realization that he had just scratched the surface of a story that was far more complicated and far more real than he had ever imagined. In the days that followed their unexpected encounter at the grocery store, Lucas found himself increasingly consumed by thoughts of Grace. Her presence lingered in his mind, even in the quiet moments when he least expected it. The way she had looked at him in the store, the way she seemed so effortlessly protective of her niece and nephew, left a mark on him that he couldn't shake. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of something deeper, something hidden, and it both intrigued and unsettled him. Lucas had always been someone who thrived on control. In business, in his personal life, in everything he did, he had learned to master his environment. But with Grace, he found himself at a loss. She had become this elusive enigma, a mystery he couldn't quite solve. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized how little he actually knew. What he thought had been a simple, quiet connection was now beginning to reveal layers, depths, and complexities he hadn't expected. He couldn't stop thinking about the children. It wasn't just that they were hers, or that they weren't. There was something about the way they were with her. The natural ease with which they interacted, the familiarity in their laughter, the tenderness in her touch as she adjusted their small hands on the grocery cart. It was clear that they were a big part of her life. But why had she kept them a secret from him? Why hadn't she ever mentioned them? His mind continued to circle back to the same unanswered questions, and as the days passed, Lucas found himself pulling away from the things that usually held his attention. Work became a blur. The meetings, the deals, the ceaseless demands of his company, all of it felt distant, as if he were operating on autopilot. There were moments when he felt guilty about it, guilty for being distracted, guilty for allowing something as simple as a woman and her hidden life to take up so much of his thoughts. But it wasn't something he could control. He had never felt this drawn to anyone before, not like this, not with such intensity. Lucas knew he had to talk to Grace again. The questions in his mind had grown too loud, too overwhelming. He had to understand, to get answers, to see if this connection, whatever it was, could continue to grow. But he also knew that approaching her with his suspicions would only complicate things further. She had been so guarded, so careful with what she shared, and he had to respect that. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she had let on. Something deeper, something painful perhaps, hidden behind that calm and composed exterior. Lucas had learned to read people over the years. It was a skill he had honed in the business world, but it had served him well in life too. He could sense the way Grace held back, the way she smiled but didn't truly let anyone in. She had built walls around herself, and though he wasn't sure if he could ever break them down, he knew he was willing to try. He decided to take a different approach. Instead of pushing her, instead of forcing her to reveal more, he would simply be there. He would show up when she needed him, quietly supporting her without pushing for answers. He wasn't sure what this would mean for them, or if it would lead to anything more than what they already had, but it felt like the only way forward. If Grace was going to share her life with him, it would have to be on her terms. So he did what he had always done best. He waited. The next time he saw her, it was in the park. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the sky was a bright, clear blue. Lucas had been walking through the park alone, enjoying the rare quiet of the weekend. He was dressed casually, in a pair of jeans and a simple shirt, trying for once to blend in with the rest of the world. As he passed by one of the playgrounds, he saw her again, sitting on a bench, watching the children as they ran and played. It was a moment of normalcy that he hadn't expected. In his world, everything was orchestrated, everything was planned. But here, in this park, everything felt genuine. The laughter of the children, the peacefulness of the scene, it was all so far removed from the world he knew. And there, sitting on the bench, was Grace. She didn't see him right away. He stood there for a moment, watching her as she looked out at the children, her gaze soft, almost distant. It was the first time he had ever seen her like this, away from the office, away from the routines she had carefully built around herself. She looked human, vulnerable even. The calm strength she usually exuded had softened, and he realized that perhaps this was the real Grace, the one who wasn't on guard, the one who didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. As he got closer, she turned her head and smiled when she saw him. It wasn't the guarded smile he had come to expect, but something warmer, more open. "Lucas," she said, her voice easy, like the weight of the past few days hadn't happened at all. "I didn't expect to see you here." He sat down beside her on the bench, taking in the quiet surroundings. "I didn't expect to be here either," he admitted, glancing over at the children as they played. "But it's a nice change of pace." Grace laughed softly, a sound that felt like a breath of fresh air. "Yeah, it is. Sometimes I think we forget how good it feels just to breathe. To do something that's not tied to work or expectations." Lucas nodded, his gaze still on the children. "It's easy to get caught up in all of it, isn't it?" "Yeah," Grace agreed. She paused for a moment, her fingers playing absent-mindedly with the strap of her bag. "I'm glad you came. The kids, they've been through a lot lately. It's hard, sometimes, to keep things together." Her words were soft, almost hesitant, as if she were testing the waters to see if he would respond, if he would offer her a safe space to talk. Lucas, sensing the subtle invitation, chose his words carefully. "You don't have to explain anything to me, Grace, but I'm here whenever you're ready to talk. I'm not going anywhere." She turned her head toward him, meeting his eyes for the first time since their encounter at the store. Her gaze was searching, as if weighing him, assessing him in a way she hadn't before. For a long moment, they simply sat in silence, the world around them continuing as it always did. And in that silence, Lucas felt the walls between them begin to crumble, just a little. Grace finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now, as if she were sharing something deeply personal, a secret she had kept hidden for too long. "The kids, their parents passed away. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I was never supposed to be the one to raise them." The words hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. He hadn't expected that. It was one thing to help raise them, to be an aunt or a guardian. But to hear that their parents were gone, that she was shouldering this responsibility on her own, without anyone to help her, that made everything fall into place. The careful walls she had built, the distance she kept between them, it wasn't because of him. It was because of the weight of her life, the grief, the responsibility. And in that moment, Lucas realized that Grace's life was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The days that followed were filled with quiet understanding. Lucas kept his promise to Grace. He was there for her without expectation, without pressing her to reveal more than she was willing to share. It was a different kind of connection than what he had been used to, gentle, patient, and without the usual rush. He noticed the little things about her that he hadn't before. The way she always put others' needs first, how she would pick up every stray piece of paper in her office, or how she never let the children feel left out of anything, even if it meant she had to sacrifice her own time and energy. It wasn't just about the kids either. Grace had a way of making him feel like he was more than just another man in her life. She had this rare ability to make him feel seen and understood without trying. When they spoke, it wasn't always about grand gestures or deep emotional confessions. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts, and yet the connection between them would grow stronger with each passing day. Lucas couldn't help but wonder what had shaped her into the person she was. She was strong and resilient, yet there was a softness about her that drew him in. It was as if she had experienced hardships, struggles, that most people would never understand. But rather than breaking her, those struggles had somehow made her more empathetic, more compassionate. Lucas found himself fascinated by this quiet strength of hers, this ability to endure while never complaining, never seeking attention. There was still so much about her life that she hadn't revealed. He didn't know much about her past before the children came into her life, or the circumstances that had led her to become their guardian. But even as the mystery of her life lingered in his mind, he didn't feel the same urgency to uncover it. The desire to learn more was there, but it wasn't a need. It was a curiosity, one that came from a place of respect. He wasn't pushing her for answers, but rather letting things unfold at her pace. He realized that whatever happened, whatever revelations came to light, wouldn't change how he felt about her. One evening, after a particularly long workday, Lucas found himself heading to the small cafe down the street from the agency. He hadn't planned on seeing Grace there, but as luck would have it, she was sitting alone at a corner table, her laptop open, her eyes focused on the screen in front of her. There was a calm about her that seemed to make the rest of the world disappear. She didn't look up as he approached, so he quietly took the seat across from her. Grace glanced up when she heard the chair scrape against the floor, and when she saw him, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Lucas," she said, her voice soft, warm. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same thing," he replied, settling into his chair. "But I'm glad I did. How's the work going?" "Busy," she said with a laugh, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that was forced. It was genuine, and it made Lucas realize how little he'd heard her laugh since they'd started spending time together. Her laughter was a rare gift, and when it came, it was like the world brightened just a little bit. "I understand," Lucas said, glancing at the screen. "Seems like you're working on something important." Grace sighed, closing her laptop with a soft click. "It's a big project for the agency. I've been working on it for weeks, and honestly, I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed. But I guess that's the job, right?" She gave him a small, tired smile. Lucas didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her face for a moment, noticing the tiredness behind her eyes. He knew she carried a lot on her shoulders, and even though she rarely asked for help, it was clear that she was human, too, someone who needed a break, needed to feel supported. He wanted to be that person for her, the one who showed up not because it was expected, but because he cared. "You know," Lucas said after a moment, "if you need a break, I'm happy to help. I know a place just around the corner that makes the best pastries. It's small, not fancy, but sometimes that's exactly what you need." Grace raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Are you trying to bribe me with pastries?" "Well," Lucas said, leaning back in his chair with a grin, "I'm not saying it's a bribe, but I do believe in the power of chocolate croissants to make everything feel a little better." She laughed again, and this time, it was louder, a genuine sound of amusement that made Lucas feel like he'd won some small victory. He loved the way her smile lit up the room, and he found himself hoping she would let him in just a little bit more. Grace paused, considering his offer. "Okay, I'll take you up on that, but only if you promise to let me pay for my own croissant." "Deal," Lucas said, standing up. "Let's go, and don't worry about paying. I insist." As they walked toward the door, side by side, Lucas felt a surge of something unfamiliar, something that went beyond the attraction he had first felt toward her. There was a sense of ease now between them, a kind of unspoken bond that he couldn't ignore. The more he spent time with Grace, the more he realized that she was no ordinary woman. She was thoughtful, independent, and had this quiet strength that he hadn't seen in anyone else. But there was still something weighing on him. Something he hadn't fully understood about her past. She had shared a little bit about the kids and the responsibility she had taken on, but there were so many unanswered questions. What had happened to their parents? Why had Grace chosen this path for herself? And most importantly, what was the real reason she had kept them hidden from him for so long? As they entered the cafe, Lucas found himself feeling more determined to understand. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about being there for her, no matter what it turned out to be. Because in the time they had spent together, he had come to realize that Grace Moore was someone worth waiting for, someone who deserved to be loved without conditions, without judgment. And in that moment, as they sat down with their pastries, Lucas knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. He would stay. He would be there for her, whether she was ready to open up or not. And when the time came, when she was ready to share everything, he would be there to listen. Because, for the first time in his life, he realized that love wasn't about rushing in to fix everything. It was about being patient, being present, and letting someone reveal their heart at their own pace. The weeks that followed were filled with an unexpected sense of peace. Lucas, in all his experience with the fast-paced, high-stakes world of business, had never anticipated that the simple act of being present in someone's life could feel so fulfilling. But with Grace, it was different. It wasn't about grand gestures or lofty ambitions. It was about the quiet moments they shared together. The slow walks through the park, the late-night talks that stretched into the early hours of the morning, the way their silences were no longer uncomfortable but comforting, as if they understood each other without needing to speak. Still, Lucas couldn't help but wonder about Grace's past, about the life she had lived before he had come into it. There was a part of him that knew it wasn't just curiosity that drove him. It was the undeniable feeling that something more profound was hidden beneath the surface of her calm exterior, something he needed to understand in order to fully know her. But every time he asked her about her history, Grace would deftly change. It wasn't until much later, after I had started rebuilding my life, that the twins came into the picture. They were just babies, barely 3 years old. Their mother, my sister, had passed away unexpectedly, and there was no one else to take them in. I couldn't turn my back on them. So I took them in. I became their guardian, their protector. I had no idea what I was doing at first. I was terrified. But slowly, I began to understand. They became my world. They healed me in ways I never thought possible. And I realized that even though I wasn't perfect, I was enough. I could be enough for them. Grace paused, her eyes welling up with tears she didn't shed, but Lucas could see the vulnerability in her that she rarely allowed others to witness. She looked at him, her gaze steady, but the rawness of her words hung in the space between them. I had to grow up fast, Lucas, she continued. I had to put my own dreams on hold for a while. I had to make sacrifices I wasn't ready for. But every day, I woke up and did it all over again. For them. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being the person I was before. I became someone else, someone stronger. But I've never really talked about it. I've never let anyone in. Not fully. Not until now. Lucas reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers. He didn't speak at first, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew that words weren't enough. What mattered was that she had shared her story, her truth, with him. And in that moment, he understood her more deeply than he ever had before. "You're incredible, Grace," he said quietly. "I don't know how you've done it all. But I'm so glad you did, and I'm even more glad that you're letting me be part of your life now." Her eyes softened, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. "I'm glad too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But there's still so much more to figure out, and I'm not sure what the future holds, Lucas. But I know that whatever happens, I want you to be in it. I don't want to shut you out anymore." The words hung between them, and for the first time, Lucas felt like they were standing on the edge of something deeper, something more real than he could have ever imagined. He didn't know what the future held, either, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. He would stand by her side, through all the challenges and uncertainties, because now he saw her not just as a woman he had fallen for, but as a person who had overcome unimaginable obstacles to get to where she was. And that was the kind of strength he could admire, the kind of love that deserved to be fought for. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Lucas and Grace. Despite the clarity they had gained in their relationship, the world around them seemed determined to throw obstacles in their path. Grace's past, though no longer a secret, still lingered like a shadow, and the twins, though they had become a central part of their lives, had their own challenges. They were both still adjusting to the idea of having someone new around, even if that someone was Lucas, who had shown them nothing but kindness and patience. The little ones, Lily and Sam, were still learning to trust him, to accept him as part of their lives. But it was during one of those quiet nights when everything changed. Grace had just tucked the twins into bed and was sitting at the kitchen table, going over some work when Lucas walked in. He had that familiar, determined look on his face, the one that told her something big was coming. "Grace, I think it's time we had that conversation," he said, his voice filled with a kind of urgency that caught her off guard. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly what he was referring to, but the thought of it still felt overwhelming. She had worked so hard to protect her little family, to keep the twins in a stable environment. And now Lucas was suggesting a change. The weight of that decision felt too heavy to bear, even with his steady presence beside her. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice, though it was impossible to hide the uncertainty that had crept into her heart. "I think it's time to make things official. I want to be in your life, Grace. I want to be in their lives. The twins deserve someone who will always be there for them, and I want to be that person," Lucas said, his eyes unwavering as they met hers. "I'm not saying this to rush you or to make you feel pressured, but I've been thinking about this for a while. I want us to build something together, something that lasts." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She had been so focused on her past, on her own fears and insecurities, that she had never allowed herself to imagine what a future with Lucas could look like. But hearing him say those words now, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, something in her shifted. There was no longer any room for doubt. She knew that, deep down, she had already given him a part of her heart, and it was only a matter of time before she gave him all of it. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but the wonder in her tone was unmistakable. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Lucas replied, his voice steady, his gaze never wavering from hers. "I know that we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. Your past, the twins, everything. But I believe in us. I believe in what we can build together." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of relief that flooded her heart. She had been so afraid, so uncertain, but in this moment, she realized that everything she had fought for, everything she had worked for, was worth it. She had built a life from nothing, from the wreckage of her past, and now she had a chance to create something even more beautiful, a family, a future. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't have to say anything yet," Lucas said softly, his hand reaching out to gently cup her cheek. "I'm not asking for anything, not right now. I just wanted you to know that I'm here. I'm here for you. For them. For everything." Grace let out a shaky breath, her eyes closing as she leaned into his touch, the weight of his words settling deep in her heart. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, a spark of something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in. She had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, protecting herself, protecting the twins. But Lucas wasn't asking her to be perfect. He was asking her to let him be part of their lives, to let him share the burdens and the joys, the challenges and the triumphs. "I think I'm ready," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "I think I've always been ready. I just didn't know it." Lucas smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. "Then let's do this together, Grace. Let's make it real. We'll figure it all out, one step at a time." The weeks that followed were filled with a kind of joy and peace that neither of them had expected. They began making plans for their future, creating a life that was more than just the two of them. The twins, Lily and Sam, slowly warmed up to Lucas, their once hesitant smiles now full of trust and affection. They had become a family, each one of them bringing something unique to the table. Grace's protective instincts kicked in, but now she was learning to share the load, to let Lucas be her partner, not just in name, but in every aspect of their lives. There were still challenges, of course. No family was without its obstacles. There were moments of doubt, moments of fear, but they faced them together. Grace learned that it wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about having someone who would stand beside you, no matter what. Someone who would help you carry the weight. Someone who would be there for you when everything seemed impossible. And Lucas, too, found a sense of peace in this new life. He had always been driven by success, by the desire to conquer, to build, to achieve. But with Grace and the twins, he discovered something more profound. He discovered the power of love, the kind of love that wasn't about status or wealth, but about being present, about showing up when it mattered most. In the end, they created a life together that neither had expected. A life filled with laughter, with love, with moments of quiet joy and profound connection. They had learned that no matter how complicated the past, no matter how uncertain the future, there was always room for hope, always room for change. And that sometimes, the greatest gifts in life were the ones that came when you least expected them. Grace and Lucas had started as two people from different worlds, but now they were building a future together. And that was the most beautiful thing of all.